I'm Lisa Senecal.
And I'm Maya May. And tonight we're speaking with historian Nicole Hemmer about the GOP's decade-long transformation into the clear, very clear and present danger it is today. We're speaking starts now.
Well, after last night's resounding primary loss for Liz Cheney, the GOP can just check another box on their how to become an authoritarian party to-do list. This is party purification, where anyone who won't help advance the GOP's destruction of democracy must be removed from the party. And it happens in every autocratic movement, and it's incredibly dangerous.
Incredibly. And let's not forget that Liz Cheney voted along with Donald Trump's ideology most of the time. And Harriet Hagman was flip-flopping back and forth all over the place. And if you haven't Googled this woman, I highly recommend that you do, because it'll give you a clear understanding that the people of Wyoming have chosen autocracy over democracy. That's truly what they did. And so I'm actually glad that it happened, because I think it's important that America sees right now just how far the Republican Party is willing to go. And it's dangerous. It's happening all over the place. Florida is one of the places that they're rolling out all of this, like, laws that they're enacting that are basically just repressing and attacking our fellow Americans. And there is a long history to that. And so I'm really incredibly excited. Lisa, you and I have been talking about the history and how it's brought us to here. So our guest tonight is...
Oh, perfect.
Yeah.
Yep. Our guest tonight is Nicole Hemmer. In her words, she has mainlined all 7 seasons of Parks and Rec more times than she can count, and has never identified with a character more than Leslie Knope, which I think some of us can also identify with. Oh, and she also does not know all the words to the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air theme song. I do, but I am going to spare all of you that this evening.
That'll be in the outtakes. We might have to do that at the end. I'm just saying. Nicole is also a political historian. She's a scholar specializing in media, conservatism, and the far right, which is basically now the GOP. She's got a brilliant new book out. It's called Partisans, the Conservative Revolutionaries Who Remade American Politics in the 1990s. It will be released on August 30th, but you can pre-order it now. Welcome back to the show, Nicole Hemmer. Hi.
Hi, thank you so much for having me back. I'm going to try to bring some of that Leslie Knope spirit to this conversation.
We need it.
Fantastic. We've got to channel a lot of Leslie Knope to at least get through the midterms, if not all the way to the 2024 election. So the book doesn't come out until the 30th. As Maya said, you can pre-order it, but you were kind enough to share an advance copy with me and Maya. It's brilliant. Reading Partisans, it seems Republican leaders kind of birthed this GOP monster of today more than 30 years ago, and it grew up and then ate the party. So
chomp, 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 chomp. Yeah.
How did that happen?
Well, it happened in large part because things on the ground changed quite a lot in the 1990s. The Cold War ended, and so that rhetorical commitment to democracy went away. The economy started to change. The 1990s start with a major recession. Deindustrialization means that there are a lot of people in a shakier circumstance than they had been before. And perhaps most importantly, the media landscape completely changes in the 1990s. You have the rise of talk radio, the rise of cable news, the first stirrings of the internet, and all of that gives rise to this new right that's kind of like the old right of the 1930s and 1940s, but with a newer media and a real axe to grind against the America of the 1980s.
Yeah, and it actually struck me in the book. You talked about fax trees and the fact that they were able to connect with each other that way. And I was like, oh, I actually remember these. And now, of course, with social media, these ideals, which are so dangerous, are spreading like wildfire. It's crazy. And one of these, and you mentioned it in the book, that Newsweek once said the GOP thought George H.W. Bush was basically a wimp. which of course, like he was a World War II fighter pilot, head of the CIA. So I'm not quite sure how that's true, but can you talk about how that take on masculinity, basically, like how it may have affected the party going forward?
Oh, it had a huge consequence for the party, because this idea that George H.W. Bush wasn't tough enough wasn't just about the image that he presented to the world, but the policies that he held, that he wasn't conservative enough, that he wasn't radically committed to these principles the way that the right wanted him to be. And so they really construct themselves and their image against that they're going to be the toughest, that they're going to say the hard truths, that they're not going to be polite and waspy the way that George H.W. Bush was, and they're going to bring a meaner spirit to politics. And that's something that they do along with a more hardline politics.
That cruelty is the point is something that gets said a lot now, but you make the case really beautifully that's been going on for decades in the Republican Party. And that cruelty, masculinity and gender in general is the through line in a lot of our political conversations. You mentioned the feminine cowgirl chutzpah in your book. Can you I love that. Can you tell us about how like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert and Sarah Palin embodied that caricature?
They very much come out of this type that is emerging in the 1990s of these feminist, anti-feminist. They're conservatives. They are professional women. They've benefited from the gains of the feminist movement of the 1970s. A lot of them are lawyers or politicians or pundits, but they are anti-feminist. They are opposed to the feminist movement. They are opposed to affirmative action. And they sort of model themselves after, you said feminist cowgirl chutzpah, but after a kind of masculine energy as well, right? They're very into guns, for instance. They focus on gun rights over abortion rights. And they blend that with the fact that they're women in order to kind of soften the radicalism of their politics.
Yeah, and this sort of like stand by your man energy is kind of what it feels like. And I feel like a lot of people tend to think it's just the men, but we're obviously seeing it. One of the things that really struck me in the book was hearing about Ruby Ridge again and Waco. Like I was in high school when those things were going down, and I kind of almost erased them from my memory. And so hearing about that, Oklahoma City and militias, which were basically aligned, as you mentioned, with Republicans starting to kind of like converge, and now we're looking at January 6th, obviously. How has the Republicans' love affair with right-wing militias put our democracy in danger?
Oh, I think that looking back at Waco and Ruby Ridge is so important because we know that there were far-right militias and white supremacist groups that were involved in these things, but we often have lost track of the role that Republican office holders played in mainlining both the militias and their conspiracy theories. You were just talking about Liz Cheney. There were a number of women members of Congress from the Mountain West, including a woman who represented Idaho named Helen Chenoweth. And she backed the militias. They were part of her campaign. She represented the part of Idaho that Ruby Ridge is in, and she embodied their conspiracy theories. She held hearings about black helicopters, which was this United Nations conspiracy. When the Oklahoma City bombing happened, she didn't push back against the militias. She said, maybe there's a reason why they're so mad. Maybe we should be listening to them instead of jailing them.
Right. And that's stuff that we've heard, with Trump echoing, there's good people on both sides. And so it's like there was clearly a roadmap for this that they've been following this whole time. And now we're here.
Now here we are.
We're here, and the reading your book, it was really apparent that there were very obvious signs that this is where the Republican Party was heading, but there were people, both politicians, voters, and the consultants who worked in the Republican side, who they didn't see it if they were in the center, or wanting to believe they were more in the center. But then Trump came from outside politics, right? He didn't have any of that. He has no allegiance to party, any deeply held beliefs. He doesn't have any morals, none of these things that constrain normal people. But did that enable him to see where the party was headed and take advantage of that when insiders weren't seeing it?
I think that's exactly right. That, the party was definitely ready for a takeover by Donald Trump by 2015. But if you take the long road to 2015 from 1990, you see somebody like Pat Buchanan, who himself was an entertainer. He had come up through Crossfire on CNN and the McLaughlin Group on PBS. He was somebody people knew because of his media platforms. He ran for president 3 times. He didn't win the nomination any of the times. At the same time, in 1996, Colin Powell was a viable possible candidate for the Republican Party. So you could see, if you wanted to believe in that other part of the Republican Party, there were enough signs that if you just kind of put blinders on and didn't want to pay attention to what was emerging in the party, you could say, okay, there's a Pat Buchanan out there, but there's also a Colin Powell. So we're going to be okay because we can still choose the Colin Powell direction.
Can we though? Because never did I actually think that I'd sit here being whimsical for Colin Powell. When you said it, I almost daydreamed for a second. I was Condoleezza Rice. Never in a million years did I think I'd be in this place where I'm at now. And so even just after last night, we talked about it at the top of the show with Liz Cheney losing, it feels like they have made a choice. And so there is no resurrecting the Republican Party. I can't, it's not about conservatism. It is about guns and gods and states' rights, which really at this point code to discriminate. Is there a return to normal? I mean, in reality, do you think there's a path?
I mean, not anytime soon. And I think the elections of the last few months have borne that out, particularly Cheney's loss last night. There's every incentive in the party right now, be it elections, be it fundraising, be it media, all are pushing the party in its current direction, away from democracy, away from any sort of organizing ideology, really, and toward this kind of power-based, loyalty-based politics that have taken over the party in the last 4 to 5 years. So can something dramatically change? Sure, parties have dramatically changed in the past, but it would take some pretty serious exogenous events, some outside events, as well as just a cataclysmic reshuffling of the personnel of the party.
Right, and I would think Trump being investigated by the FBI would be cataclysmic, and yet
that's wonderfully optimistic.
We try to do that once in a while here. You kind of have to be. That returning to normal thing, normal, I don't even know what that could possibly mean to people who are still saying it, because when was normal? Was that in 1988 at the end of the Reagan administration? Because at that point, Black Americans had already fled from the Republican Party starting in 1964. So when they opposed the Civil Rights Act. So when is a return to what is that party? Because it hasn't existed for a really long time. And with the demographics of America changing, even going back to the 1965 Republican Party doesn't work.
Yeah, I think when people talk about a return to normalcy, though, they are thinking about the 1960s when Barry Goldwater had won the nomination, but he lost the election. You still had both moderate and liberal Republicans, people like Governor Rockefeller, people like Mitt Romney's dad. You still had a part of the party that was pro-feminism, pro-abortion rights, pro-civil rights. They might have had a different way of going about it, but there were still a faction within the party that believed in those things. And you had a party that was still interested in democracy, right? You have Republicans in the Senate who are voting for the Voting Rights Act at a higher margin than Democrats are voting for it. So I think that that's the Republican Party that people think of when they think of a return to normalcy. That party hasn't been around for more than half a century. So it might be necessary to recalibrate what exactly we mean by normal when we talk about that return to normalcy. And we also have to deal with the reality on the ground and how much things have changed, not just in the past 30 years, but in the past 5 to 10.
Yeah, I would say Republicans need a real come to Jesus moment, and not Republican Jesus, the Jesus that they actually espouse. Because, and even Biden mentioned that this is a battle for the soul of our nation. And at the same time, hyperpartisanship is creating this moment where it feels like we can't come together, that we can't have consensus. We need two parties. Andrew Yang, don't need him with his third party. So what do we do to get back to sanity?
Well, look, that idea of consensus has to start with a set of shared values. And those shared values can't be the shared values between the two parties of, say, the 1950s. That's not going to work. But a set of shared values and a set of core commitments to democratic governance, to the protection of civil liberties and civil rights. It has to have this kind of shared baseline. And until you can agree on those things, then you have to have pitched battles about the direction of the country, because you are talking about existential things, and you can't compromise. You can't compromise on voting. You can't compromise on, people's basic civil rights. And I don't think that anyone should be asked to compromise on those things.
Truly.
Yeah, I don't know where the Republican Party begins to even do that, especially because you've mentioned social media a couple of times. That is such a loud, booming, ugly echo chamber that the power that it has in state races, as well as these big national races that we tend to pay more attention to, it's just huge. So given that it's taken 50 years to get to where the party is now, and now you factor in social media, what begins to, is it just losing over and over again for the next 2, 4, 6, 8 years that breaks the fever?
So that would be part of it. I mean, if your North Star is power, not being able to obtain it would be one way to go about this. And that actually requires not just voters showing up and rejecting Republicans at the ballot box, but it also requires Democrats, and here's where I'm going to get my Leslie Knope energy going, to pay attention to local and state races, to build their party and to show what they can do for people at the local and state level. So that's a way that they can both win control over elections, so that they can ensure that small d democratic values are protected. But it also makes the party more popular. Right? We tend to talk in these big national terms, but people care about who can make sure that the potholes are fixed, or who can make sure that Medicaid expansion is passed in their state. And those are the kinds of things that Democrats should be focusing on, in addition to focusing on pointing out the flaws in the Republican Party.
I love that you say that, because I've been truly energized by people like Mallory McMorrow. We've had her on the show because she showed the way to control the narrative, and also build for the people of her state. And so my concern is, like, how loud do we have to be? Like, is part of writing your book, are you hoping to communicate to people what needs to be done, like right now in the short term, to protect us in the long term? Because I love you had in the bio for your podcast about hindsight for foresight. I know I'm butchering that, but I love the way you stated it. What are your thoughts on, like, how do we communicate this? How do we make sure that people hear what you have to say, what Mallory McMorrow has to say? It just feels like it's always being drowned out by the lunacy and the lies.
Yeah. So our tagline is turning hindsight into foresight. And that idea that we should be thinking about how things come about historically in order to know how to counter them in the present. So if you just think that Donald Trump is a phenomenon who emerged in 2015 and he took over the Republican Party and he's just this aberration, then you're going to have a different set of solutions. You're just going to focus on Donald Trump, and that will return the Republican Party to quote unquote normal. That doesn't seem to me to be the right explanation. And so it's going to lead you to a different set of solutions, which is that there's a wholesale problem with the Republican Party that needs to be addressed. And I think over the past few years, people have started to catch up with that. But continuing to show how thin the lines are between formal political office holding and radicalism, to point that out, to pay attention to domestic terrorism and domestic extremism, and to use the tools of the government when it's appropriate to make sure that that violence doesn't overwhelm our system. I mean, some of that is stuff that the Biden administration has now caught up on. But I hope that, if people are reading the book, they understand that these were, by and large, ordinary people. It was a guy who was a radio sports host who turns his show into the biggest political phenomenon of the 1990s, Rush Limbaugh. It is a history teacher from Georgia who decides to run for Congress and ends up Newt Gingrich, Speaker of the House, refashions Republican politics for at least a decade. So these are ordinary people who figure out how to work the political system and the media system and to turn it toward their ends. And they were successful in that. And there is some hope in that message, because it doesn't require you to be a superhero. It doesn't require you to have superpowers. It just requires you to have a goal and to pursue it.
So let's talk about the media for a minute, since you mentioned how some of this mess started. The phenomenon of Rush Limbaugh on the radio and the monstrous following he had, and you spoke, or you wrote in the book about Mitch McConnell being a new member of Congress and really being forced to follow the lead of Rush Limbaugh. And then you had the Lou Dobbs phenomenon that was allowed to go on way too long at CNN after they knew what he was doing. He was really the original Tucker Carlson doing the, hey, I'm just saying, I'm not, saying it's a fact, but I'm just asking questions. So the media has evidence that they have not done this well leading up to this point. Are they getting that at this point? Is there a way to make them get it faster?
So that was something that I really wanted to focus on in this book. So my first book was about the history of conservative media, and conservative media play a huge role in the politics of the 1990s, but so does CNN and MSNBC and Comedy Central and the Washington Post. The role of non-conservative media in propping up and developing this right-wing punditry that has become so popular today. Lou Dobbs spreading vicious anti-immigrant sentiment, birtherism on CNN for years and not being stopped. I think that there has been more awareness recently. You're hearing a lot more criticism from the left of mainstream media outlets for the role that they play in not shining a light on fascists, but sort of giving them a platform. And I do think that there are a number of outlets who have gotten better at that. Not great. There's still a lot of problems in a lot of places, but there are also more alternative media now too that can point to the ways that established media maybe haven't fully gotten on board with the need for more aggressive policing of the anti-democratic figures who they've propped up over decades now. So yeah, I think some media outlets have learned, but I thought that it was important to show that those same outlets played an enormous role in providing a platform to anti-democratic groups over the years.
Yeah, and I'm incredibly concerned. I have a high schooler, and I see Charlie Kirk out there with Turning Point, and I see it being normalized. And we know, like, we always think, oh, the youth will save us. But Gen Z is all on TikTok, and there's a ton of right-wing TikTokers. There's PragerU. And so do you feel like Democrats, progressives, sane people are doing enough to counteract that? And if not, like, what do we all need to go to, like, a boot camp for a few weeks and learn how to do media right?
I mean, I do think that there's something to that. That's what the right has done. I mean, over the course of decades now, they've built journalism centers for right-wing pundits and journalists. They've done all kinds of training sessions. Turning Point does training sessions on how to use TikTok, on how to use social media. So there is some value to having some specific training in how to use these tools. I think that there has been much more of a habit and a philosophy on the right to create alternative media, to focus on messaging. And that is something that it has taken quite a while for liberals and folks on the left to catch up with. So no, I don't think that they're doing enough. There needs to be kind of a two-pronged approach, which is to expose misinformation on those platforms, but then also be doing positive, informed messaging as well.
The other thing we haven't touched on that I found really fascinating in the book was you just talked about alternative media. The Republicans have done a great job of priming people for alternative reality with the conspiracy theories that they seem so ready to consume. And you write in your book, like Vince Foster, the conspiracy about his death, and it started way back then and has just been a thread since the Clinton administration of Republicans getting people to buy into these nutty conspiracy theories. And we end up at QAnon and the big lie.
Yeah, and raising money with it.
Right.
Exactly. Winning office with it, raising money with it, selling newspapers with it. I thought it was so important to go back and look at the conspiracies of the Clinton era, because, I mean, there were websites, early websites in the 1990s that were like the Clinton body count, that attributed dozens of murders to Bill and Hillary Clinton. The Vince Foster conspiracy was one that wasn't just on the fringes. It was something that was talked about on the floor of Congress. Bob Dole, when he was running in 1996, called it the supposed murder of Vince Foster. It was something that the Wall Street Journal wrote about, and that there was a ton of money flowing into to make sure that those conspiracies had lots of oxygen and were circulated across the country, and they were. So those conspiracies, I think, are worth looking at because they do feel awfully familiar today.
Completely. And we're almost out of time. So I think since we're talking about conservative media, it's important to talk about Fox News, obviously, because they're a big part of spreading all of this misinformation, disinformation, lies. But there was a Fox News poll that's actually promising for Democrats. Is it possible that the GOP has overplayed its racist, misogynistic, bigoted, anti-LGBTQ, uber rich, everything? Like, what happens next?
Yeah, I mean, people have said at many junctures throughout the past 30 years that the GOP has gone too far, and that they're going to pay a price. And at times they do. So I don't want to suggest that there's no hope there. And we've even seen more recently in, say, the 2010, 2012, 2014 elections, some far-right candidates ran and they cost Republican seats. And that could very easily happen in 2022 when there's such thin margins separating Democrats and Republicans from controlling either house. So yes, I mean, there is hope. There are ways that candidates can go too far. It's just the general direction of the party seems to be going in a not great direction.
Well, I'm going to hang on to the part that maybe in 2022 they've gone too far, and that we can amplify that and get people out to vote, because they really have gone way too far, even if their voters don't recognize it. Hopefully Democratic voters have, and they will come out in force. And then we would love to talk with you again, either before or after the midterms. It's always a fascinating conversation, Nicole. And everybody, Partisans comes out on the 30th. Pre-order. It's a great, great book.
Really good read. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, y'all, you have heard the history. You know we've been here before. And Lisa and I have been just talking about this nonstop lately because for a lot of it, it hits close to home for me because as a marginalized American, reading about this stuff and knowing that it was a part of our history and that they're using these exact same techniques now is kind of, it's frustrating. But we have the opportunity to stop it. And so thank you, Lisa, for bringing up the midterms, because right now I'm just like, voter participation can get us out of this.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's, the numbers are there. It's just about participation. So we know that the folks who watch all the Lincoln Project programming, you're participating. Encourage everyone you can to join in that participation. Everything is at stake right now in this country, and the 22 midterms, they're just huge. We can't wait to fix this in 2024. That might not be an opportunity anymore. So thank you for everything that you do in supporting the Lincoln Project. Without you, we're not here. Any donations that you make, large or small, means that the Lincoln Project does not have to ever sell ads or be beholden to any corporations, any big source of power. You are the power behind the Lincoln Project. So help when you can, when you're able, and thank you for all the work you do on the behalf of democracy.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you can't donate, you can always share our shows. You can drop those links in your group chats to your friends. The more you share our content, the more people are able to learn about people like Nicole Hemmer and her book and educate themselves. Because if we are more informed, we can get ourselves out of this. We have a better understanding of how important getting out the vote for the midterms are. If we understand that there's a shortage of poll workers and we need people to volunteer, we still have time. I think we're only 82, 83 days out from the midterms. And so there is plenty of time to make sure that we've got boots on the ground and that we're doing the work. So please give us a follow. Turn on notifications. I'm going to say it like the YouTubers do. Turn on your notifications for the Lincoln Project. Follow Lisa at LC Senecal. She's over there that way. And follow me at Maya on stage.
Yeah. And watch the breakdown. Coming back tomorrow night with Tara Setmayer and Rick Wilson, also at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 Pacific. And follow our ads. Before we go, take a look at the Lincoln Project's latest one, and we will see you all next week.
We get it, Donald. You hate us.
To the Losers Project.
And hey, we're not your biggest fans either. But there's one thing you know. We've never lied to you. In a funny way. We're the only people you could trust. We told you that you'd lose, and you did.
But you didn't listen. Now you're losing.
That Mike Pence would stab you in the back on January 6th, and he did.
He's backing away from your train wreck.
How Mitch and Kevin were using your name for money and power, and they are.
Mitch McConnell's Washington consultants are making big money using your name.
And we told you Ron DeSantis was coming for you.
He's making it his Republican Party.
And now he thinks he's bigger than you.
You've probably heard this before, but it was smaller than we expected.
Now we're telling you the truth again.
And there's no one you can trust. No one.
They're turning on you. All of them. We tell you we're sad for you. But like we said before, we always tell you the truth.